There are men who kill for ideology, men who kill for revenge, men who kill because some fracture deep inside their soul demands it. And then there is Slade Wilson. Slade Wilson kills because someone writes a number on a piece of paper, and that number is acceptable. There is no passion in it, no trembling hand, no moment of moral hesitation before the trigger pull. There is only the contract, the preparation, and the execution. In that order, always in that order. The file arrived on an encrypted server he checks once a week. No name attached to the client, no agency watermark, just coordinates, a wire transfer confirmation for half the fee up front, and a brief dossier on a string of disappearances across a mid-sized European city. 37 people in 60 days. No bodies recovered. Local authorities had written it off as organized crime, human trafficking, the usual explanations governments lean on when they do not want to look deeper. But the client was not a government. The client knew that whatever was happening beneath that city had nothing to do with ordinary crime, and the client wanted answers. Slade accepted the contract the way he accepts every contract, without sentiment. He packed light, 2 modified sidearms, a Prometheum sword he had carried through 11 conflicts, body armor layered with microwave plating that could stop a .50 caliber round at close range. He did not know what he was walking into. But Slade Wilson has never once in his life needed to know what he was walking into in order to walk out of it alive. The city greeted him with rain, narrow cobblestone streets glistening under amber lamplight, old architecture pressing in from both sides like the walls of a canyon. He set up in a safe house within the first 6 hours and began doing what he does better than anyone alive. He watched. He studied surveillance footage the client had provided. And within the first night, the cracks in reality began to show. The footage was grainy, pulled from private security cameras near the disappearance sites. But what it captured was unmistakable to a trained eye. Figures moving at speeds no human body could achieve. Shapes flickering between shadow and streetlight as if the darkness itself were alive. In one clip, a man was dragged from a parked car so quickly that the camera only registered a blur and then an empty seat. In another, something massive and hunched barreled through a steel fire door like it was made of paper. Slade watched each clip exactly 3 times. The first to observe, the second to catalog, the third to find the pattern. And there was always a pattern. The disappearances clustered around specific locations. Subway entrances, storm drain, abandoned construction sites that led underground. Whatever was responsible for this was not living on the surface. He was living beneath it. He descended on the 4th night, through a service tunnel connected to a decommissioned subway line into a darkness so complete that even his enhanced eye needed a moment to adjust. The air changed immediately. It smelled of damp stone and old iron and something else, something animal, something that reminded him of a battlefield after the fighting ends, but before the medics arrive. He moved silently, every step placed with the precision of a man who has navigated kill zones on 4 continents. And then he heard it. Not word, not gunfire, something older. A sound like tearing meat and cracking bone layered over hissing and guttural roars that bounced off tunnel walls and came from everywhere at once. He pressed against a concrete pillar and looked down into a wide subterranean chamber, and what he saw there rewrote every assumption he had carried into this contract. Below him, 2 forces were at war. On one side, pale figures in dark leather moved with a speed that made his enhanced reflexes feel sluggish by comparison. They struck with coordinated precision, blades and firearms used in tandem, their movements almost beautiful in their lethality. On the other side, enormous creatures, half human and half something far worse, tore through the pale figures with claws the length of combat knives, shrugging off gunfire, regenerating wounds in real time. Vampires and Lycan, waging a war that clearly had nothing to do with the last 60 days. This war had been raging for centuries. Any other man would have turned around. Any other soldier would have called for extraction. Slade Wilson did neither. He crouched lower against the pillar, and he began to analyze. Most men process fear as an emotion. Slade Wilson processes it as data. His heart rate did not spike as he watched the carnage below. His breathing did not change. His single eye tracked each movement the way a chess grandmaster tracks pieces on a board, not reacting to individual moves but reading the architecture of the entire game. He stayed in that tunnel for 4 hours. He did not engage. He did not reveal his position. He simply watched, and in those 4 hours, he learned more about the vampire and Lycan war than most participants had learned in decades. The vampires operated like a military unit. There was a clear hierarchy in their movements. Point fighters engaged first, drawing out the Lycans, while flankers repositioned to exploit openings. Their weapons were a mix of modern firearms loaded with specialized ammunition and edged weapons designed for close-quarters lethality. Their greatest asset was speed. In a straight exchange of blows, a single vampire could reposition 3 times before a Lycan could complete one swing. But speed had a cost. Vampires were fragile relative to their enemies. A single clean hit from a Lycan could shatter bone and send a vampire tumbling. And once grounded, they became targets. Slade noted this. He filed it away. The Lycans were the opposite in almost every way. They fought with overwhelming force. No coordinated tactics. No visible chain of command during engagement. Just raw, terrifying aggression channeled through bodies that seemed designed by evolution for one purpose only: killing whatever stood in front of them. Their regeneration was remarkable. Slade watched one take 3 rounds to the chest, stagger, and then rip a vampire apart with its bare hands less than 10 seconds later. Their weakness was predictability. They charged. They swarmed. They attacked the nearest threat with no consideration for positioning or retreat. A Lycan in full transformation was arguably the most dangerous single combatant Slade had ever observed. But a Lycan pack was strategically exploitable because they fought as individuals sharing a space, not as a unit sharing a plan. Slade withdrew before dawn. He returned to his safe house and spent the next 36 hours in a state that anyone else would call obsession, but that Slade understood as preparation. He modified his ammunition. Standard rounds were useless against both factions, that much was clear from the footage. But Slade had access to materials most soldiers could only dream of. Ultraviolet microcharges that could be embedded in bullet tips. Silver nitrate compound that could be laced into fragmentation shells. He did not yet know the specific mythological weaknesses of either species, but he understood material science, and he understood that creatures who lived in darkness and creatures who transformed under moonlight both had biological relationships with specific elements that could be weaponized. He built traps. Claymore configurations rigged with UV flashbang triggers. Tripwires connected to silver-laced fragmentation charges. He mapped 7 square miles of the underground tunnel network over 3 days, identifying choke points, ambush corridors, and fallback routes that neither faction seemed to be using. And then he tested his theories. A single vampire separated from a patrol. Slade hit it with a UV-tipped round from 200 meters. The creature screamed as the entry wound erupted in blue-white flame and collapsed writhing before it could identify the shooter. 1 confirmed kill. Slade noted the result and moved on. A lone Lycan hunting rats in a drainage tunnel. Slade dropped a silver-laced gas canister from an overhead grate. The creature thrashed, its skin blistering where the particles made contact, and retreated howling into the dark. 1 confirmed reaction. Slade noted the result and moved on. He was not fighting a war. Not yet. He was conducting research, and the results were conclusive. These creatures were dangerous beyond anything he had faced before. Their speed, their strength, their ability to heal from wounds that would kill any human 3 times over. All of it was real. All of it was extraordinary. But none of it was unpredictable. And in the mind of Deathstroke, predictability is the only weakness that truly matters. Because a monster you can predict is a monster you can kill. The only question remaining was the order in which they would fall. The first real operation happened on a Tuesday. A vampire supply convoy moving weapons and blood stores through a tunnel network beneath the city's industrial district. 6 vehicles, 12 guard, enough firepower to hold a small building for a week. Slade collapsed the tunnel behind them first, then ahead of them, and then he cut the lights. What followed lasted less than 4 minutes. 12 vampires armed with automatic weapons and centuries of combat experience died in absolute darkness at the hands of a single human being who could see in it better than they expected. He used their own confusion against them. He fired from positions they could not triangulate because he never fired from the same position twice. He let them shoot at each other in the panic. And when it was over, he planted thermite charges on the supply crates and walked out through a drainage pipe he had mapped 2 days earlier. The vampires found the wreckage 8 hours later. There was no explanation that made sense within their frame of reference. No Lycan pack could have operated with that level of precision. No rival vampire coven had claimed responsibility. The convoy had simply ceased to exist, and no one could explain why. 3 nights later, Slade turned his attention to the Lycans. A pack of 9 had been staging ambushes along the eastern tunnel network, targeting vampire patrols with increasing boldness. Slade did not attack them directly. Instead, he dismantled their operation before it could begin. He identified the ambush site through movement pattern analysis. He salted the corridor with silver-laced caltrops that would shred unprotected Lycan feet during transformation. He redirected the ventilation system to push silver nitrate particulate into the staging area 30 minutes before the Lycans arrived. When the pack moved into position, half of them were already compromised. Burning, labored breathing, reduced healing. The vampire patrol they intended to ambush passed through unmolested, never knowing what had been waiting for them. The Lycans retreated in confusion. No enemy had engaged them. No shots had been fired. But their operation was ruined, and 3 of their number needed days to recover from exposure to an agent they could not identify. Within 2 weeks, Slade had conducted 11 separate operations against both factions. Supply lines disrupted, ambush sites neutralized, safe houses compromised, communication dead drops discovered and quietly monitored. He did not strike with spectacle. He struck with surgical invisibility, and that was precisely what made him terrifying. The elders of both factions began to notice. In the vampire covens, whispered conversations turned heated as commanders demanded answers for a string of inexplicable failures. Resources were vanishing. Operations were collapsing before they launched, and no intelligent source could identify the cause. Among the Lycans, the confusion was equally corrosive. Pack leaders accused each other of incompetence. Scouts reported finding traps in tunnels they had used safely for decades. The word sabotage entered conversations where it had never belonged before. Neither side suspected a human. The idea was laughable. Humans were cattle. Humans were background noise in a war that predated their entire civilization. The notion that a single human could be systematically dismantling operations on both sides of an immortal conflict was so far outside their experience that it never once entered consideration. But someone was paying closer attention than the rest. Someone whose instincts had been sharpened by centuries of hunting things that did not want to be found. Her name was Selene, a death dealer of the vampire coven, a warrior whose reputation among both factions was built not on political maneuvering or ancient bloodline, but on a simple and terrifying truth. When Selene hunted something, she found it. And when she found it, it died. She had noticed the pattern before anyone else. The disruptions were too clean, too evenly distributed between both factions. Whatever was responsible was not aligned with either side. It was something new, something operating with a methodology she had never encountered in 600 years of warfare. Selene began her hunt, and for the first time in this ancient war, the thing she was hunting was already hunting her right back. Selene found him on a rooftop. Or more precisely, she found the place where he had been. A spent observation post overlooking a Lycan transit route. Thermal blanket folded neatly, shell casings collected. Not a single fingerprint on any surface. Whoever this operative was, they understood counterforensics at a level that made Selene pause. She had hunted Lycans who tried to hide. They always left traces. Claw marks, fur caught on concrete edges. This was different. This was absence as a discipline. Whoever she was tracking did not simply avoid leaving evidence. They erased the concept of their presence from every space they occupied. It took her 3 more nights. 3 nights of following ghost trails in empty rooms and positions that had been abandoned exactly 90 seconds before she arrived. And on the 3rd night, she understood something that sent a chill through a body that had not felt cold in centuries. He was letting her find him. He was controlling the pursuit. Every trail she followed, every near miss, every almost was a breadcrumb placed with deliberate intent. He was studying her the way she studied her targets, and he had decided it was time to meet. She entered the abandoned cathedral at the north end of the tunnel network because every trail he had left pointed there. The space was vast, columns of cracked stone rising into darkness, moonlight filtering through shattered windows and painting the floor in pale geometric shapes. She moved silently, her weapons drawn, every sense extended to its maximum range. His voice came from behind a pillar 30 meters to her left. The voice of a man who had been waiting comfortably. He said he had been watching her for 5 days. He said she was the most efficient killer in either faction. He said that if she had been human, she would have found him on the first night. Selene did not respond with words. She responded with violence. A burst of gunfire aimed at the pillar, followed by an immediate flanking maneuver designed to cut off his retreat angle. It was textbook Death Dealer combat doctrine perfected over centuries. Slade was not behind the pillar when she arrived. He had moved the instant she fired, repositioning with a speed that should have been impossible for a human. She caught a glimpse of him in the moonlight. One eye, white hair, body armor that looked like it had been through more wars than most vampires had seen. And he was smiling, not with cruelty, with recognition, the way one professional acknowledges another. What followed was not a brawl. It was a conversation conducted in violence. Each strike from Selene was met with a counter that demonstrated intimate knowledge of vampire combat mechanics. He did not try to match her speed. Instead, he predicted her movement vectors and positioned himself where she would be rather than where she was. Every time she closed distance, he created separation. Every time she tried to use elevation, he controlled the ground beneath her landing zone. Selene landed a blow that would have killed any human. A straight kick to the sternum that launched Slade into a stone column hard enough to crack it. He hit the ground, rolled once, and was back on his feet in under 2 seconds. His armor had absorbed the worst of it, but the impact had clearly registered. He was hurt, but he did not slow down. He did not panic. He adjusted. And in that adjustment, Selene saw something that stopped her mid-attack. She saw discipline, not the wild survival instinct of a cornered animal, not the desperate fury of a man who knows he is outmatched. She saw the cold, mechanical recalibration of a warrior who had been hit harder before and had still completed the mission. They stood across from each other in the moonlight, both bleeding, both breathing hard, neither willing to offer the first concession. And in the silence between them, a different kind of understanding took shape. Slade spoke first. He told her the war she had been fighting for 6 centuries had no winners, that both factions were bleeding each other dry in a conflict sustained by tradition rather than purpose, that he had been hired to investigate, but what he had found was something far larger and far more broken than any contract could contain. Selene did not lower her weapons, but she did not fire. Because somewhere beneath the fury and the centuries of indoctrination, she recognized truth when she heard it. And the truth was this: the war was not ending. It was rotting, and both of them were standing in the decay. The information came in pieces over the next several days. Some of it Slade extracted from captured intelligence during his ongoing operations. Some of it came from Selene, offered not as an alliance but as a transaction. She answered his questions because his questions revealed gaps in her own understanding that she had never thought to examine. The picture that emerged was staggering. The vampire and Lycan war was not confined to this city. It was a global conflict waged in the shadows of every major population center on the planet. Ancient covens controlled financial institutions, political systems, and law enforcement agencies across dozens of countries. Lycan packs operated as underground armies, embedded in industrial sectors and criminal networks that gave them access to weapons, territory, and human recruits who would never know what they were truly serving. The scale was beyond anything Slade had encountered in decades of operating at the highest levels of human conflict. This was not a war between 2 factions. This was a parallel civilization built on blood and secrecy, and it had been running longer than most human nations had existed. Any reasonable operative would have extracted at this point. The contract was investigative. He had his answers. The wire transfer for the second half of his fee was waiting for a debrief that would satisfy the client. Walking away was the logical choice. Slade did not walk away, not because of honor, not because of some awakening moral imperative. Slade Wilson is not built for moral imperatives. He stayed because the tactical reality in front of him presented something he had never encountered before. A system so vast, so entrenched, and so ancient that no one had ever attempted to dismantle it. Not because it was impossible, but because no one with the capability had ever thought to try. Deathstroke decided to try. He began with the vampires. Not because they were the greater threat, but because their hierarchical structure made them vulnerable to decapitation strategy. Remove the right leaders and the chain of command fractures. Fracture the chain of command and coordinated operations collapse into individual survival. The first elder died in his own chambers. A Uvalast explosive device hidden inside a blood supply crate that passed through 3 security checkpoints without detection. The detonation killed the elder and 2 of his personal guard instantly. The remaining security forces found no evidence of intrusion, no breach point, no forensic trail. The elder simply ceased to exist, and the coven descended into paranoid infighting within hours. The second elder died during a diplomatic transit between safe houses. Slade intercepted the route, disabled the escort vehicles with electromagnetic pulse charges, and eliminated the target with a single silver nitrate round through the vehicle's armored window at a range of 400 meters. The entire engagement lasted 11 seconds. Within 10 days, 4 vampire elders were dead. The Coven's command structure, a hierarchy that had functioned without significant disruption for over 800 years, was in free fall. Lieutenants who had never operated without direct oversight suddenly found themselves making decisions they were not equipped to make. Alliances that had been held together by the authority of the elders began to dissolve. Paranoia replaced protocol. Slade then turned to the Lycans. Their structure was different, less hierarchical, more tribal. Eliminating a single leader would not collapse the network. But Lycan packs depended on territory, supply chains, and communication between cells. Slade did not target their leaders. He targeted their infrastructure. Safe houses were compromised. Weapons caches were destroyed or contaminated with silver compounds that would harm any Lycan who handled them. Communication routes between packs were intercepted and fed false intelligence that sent reinforcements to empty locations and left real positions exposed. Within 3 weeks, the Lycan network in the city was fractured. Packs that had operated in coordination for decades were isolated, suspicious of each other, and unable to mount organized operations. The war that had raged for centuries was breaking apart, not under the weight of some great supernatural cataclysm, not because of a prophecy fulfilled or an ancient weapon unleashed. It was breaking apart because one man with a strategic mind and no allegiance to either side had decided to take it apart piece by piece. But Slade had made a calculation that even his brilliant mind had underestimated. A controlled war, no matter how brutal, is still controlled. The elders and pack leaders he had eliminated were not just commanders. They were restraints. They held their factions in check. They enforced rules of engagement that prevented the conflict from spilling into the human world. Without them, there were no rules. Vampires fed openly. Lycans transformed and populated areas. The violence that had been carefully hidden for centuries began leaking through the cracks. And the city, the ordinary human city above the tunnels and the safe houses and the centuries of secret bloodshed, began to notice. Slade had not ended the war. He had removed its leash. And now it was running wild. It took exactly 9 days for the impossible to happen. 9 days for 2 factions that had spent centuries trying to annihilate each other to arrive at the same conclusion simultaneously. The Lycans did not trust the vampires. The vampires did not trust the Lycans. But both factions understood one truth with absolute clarity. If they did not kill the human first, there would be nothing left to fight over. The alliance was fragile, built on mutual desperation rather than mutual respect. Vampire death dealers coordinated with Lycan pack leaders for the first time in living memory. Intelligence was shared. Patrol routes were merged. Hunting parties composed of both species swept through the tunnel network in formations that combined vampire speed with Lycan endurance. Every known entry point, safe house location, and supply corridor that had been compromised was cataloged and fed into a joint operational map. They committed everything. Over 200 combatants deployed across the underground network in a systematic grid pattern designed to leave no shadow unchecked. Vampire scouts with thermal optics moved ahead of Lycan shock troops who could absorb any ambush and keep advancing. Communication relays linked every unit in real time. It was, by any measure, the most organized military operation either faction had conducted in centuries, and its sole objective was the elimination of one man. Slade knew it was coming. He had anticipated the alliance the moment he began dismantling the leadership structures. In fact, he had counted on it. Because an alliance between enemies is not a strength. It is a vulnerability wearing the disguise of strength. He let them sweep the first 3 sectors unopposed. Let them build confidence. Let the vampire commanders begin to believe the human had fled. Let the Lycan pack leaders start growling about wasted time and pointless cooperation. He let the friction build because friction between forced allies is the most potent weapon a strategist can wield. On the 4th sweep he struck, not at the combined force but at the seam between them. A vampire communications relay was destroyed with a precisely placed explosive charge. Simultaneously, a Lycan patrol received falsified intelligence indicating that the vampire units in their sector had been redeployed, leaving them exposed. The Lycans, already distrustful, interpreted the communications blackout as betrayal. The vampires, unable to reach the Lycan units to clarify, assumed their allies had gone rogue. The first shots between Alliance members were fired within 20 minutes. Slade moved through the chaos like a current through water. He engaged targets of opportunity on both sides, using weapons and tactics specifically calibrated to make each kill look like the work of the other faction. A Lycan killed with silver-tipped rounds left in a position where vampires had been operating. A vampire killed with claw-pattern wounds inflicted by a modified gauntlet Slade had built specifically for this scenario. Every death deepened the suspicion. Every explosion widened the fracture. Within 2 hours, the alliance was not just broken. It was at war with itself. Vampire units and Lycan packs engaged each other across the tunnel network with a ferocity amplified by the humiliation of having been manipulated. The careful coordination that had taken 9 days to build was destroyed in a single night by a man who understood that the oldest weakness in warfare is the alliance that does not trust itself. Slade extracted to a secondary position above the main conflict zone and watched the destruction unfold below. Vampires and Lycans tearing each other apart with a fury that surpassed anything he had observed during their original war. The restraint was gone. The leadership was gone. The fragile alliance had been the last thread of order, and he had severed it with surgical precision. By dawn, the tunnel network was a graveyard. Dozens of combatants from both factions lay in the wreckage of an operation that had been designed to kill one human, and had instead become the most devastating single engagement in the history of their ancient conflict. Slade collected his equipment, cleaned his weapons, dressed a wound on his left arm where a Lycan had come close enough to matter. And then he ascended to the surface through a drainage access point and stood in the gray morning light of a city that had no idea what had happened beneath its streets. The alliance was finished. The war was fractured beyond recognition. And somewhere in the ruins below, vampires and Lycans were learning a lesson that no immortal should ever have to learn. That a single human, properly motivated and sufficiently skilled, can be the most dangerous thing in any war. The rain returned on the last night. Slade stood on the rooftop of an office building at the edge of the financial district, looking out over a city that appeared, by every surface measurement, to be perfectly ordinary. Cars moved through wet streets. Office lights flickered in distant towers. A siren wailed somewhere to the south and faded into silence. The human world continued as it always had, completely unaware of the civilization bleeding beneath its foundations. Below the surface, the war continued. It would always continue. Slade understood that with the clarity of a man who has seen enough conflicts to know that some wars are not fought to be won. They are fought because the participants have forgotten how to exist without fighting. The vampires would rebuild their hierarchy. The Lycans would reform their packs. New elders would rise. New alliances would form and shatter. The cycle was older than any single participant, and it would outlast them all. But something had changed, something fundamental and irreversible. Both factions now moved differently. Patrols that had once operated with arrogant confidence now swept their flanks before advancing. Supply routes that had remained static for decades were rotated on irregular schedules. Safe houses were relocated. Communication protocols were overhauled. Vampire death dealers checked their perimeters twice before settling into observation posts. Lycan packs posted sentries at distances they had never bothered with before. They were afraid, not of each other. They had been afraid of each other for centuries, and that fear had become comfortable, almost ritualistic. This was a different kind of fear. This was the fear of something they could not categorize, something that did not fit within the binary framework of their eternal war, a variable that operated outside their understanding of what was possible. Slade transmitted his debrief to the anonymous client. The report was thorough. Detailed accounts of both factions, their structures, their weaknesses, their territorial holdings. Enough intelligence to keep whatever agency or organization had hired him occupied for years. The second half of his fee cleared within the hour. The contract was complete. There was no reason to remain. No unfinished objective. No personal vendetta driving him to stay. Slade Wilson does not linger. He completes the mission and moves to the next one. That is the code. That is the rhythm of his existence. He disassembled his observation post, packed his weapons, removed every trace of his presence from the rooftop with the same meticulous discipline he had applied to every position he had occupied in this city. When he was finished, there would be nothing to suggest anyone had ever stood in this place. But before he left, he allowed himself one final look at the city below. The rain falling on ancient streets, the darkness hiding a war that humanity would never know about. And somewhere down there, in the tunnels and the safe houses and the blood-soaked chambers of a conflict without end, two factions of immortal beings were operating under a new and unfamiliar constraint. The knowledge that a human had entered their war, dismantled their operations, fractured their alliance, and walked away on his own terms. Not because he was stronger, not because he was faster, not because he was immortal, because he was unpredictable. And in a war between monsters who have fought the same enemy for 1,000 years, the thing they fear most is something they have never seen before. Slade Wilson disappeared into the rain. The contract was done. The next one was waiting.